Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully this is connecting. Welcome to another Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. This is on climate change, race, and existential anxiety with professors Sarah Jacket Ray and James Rowe. My name is Lila Rothschild. I am EBF's program director. The EBF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about how our relationship with our mortality affects human behavior based on the ideas of Ernest Becker. And over 1,000 empirical studies in the US and internationally have now shown how the desire to protect ourselves from the knowledge of our mortality can serve as a driving force behind human behavior and culture. And this desire can lead us to defend our culture at all costs, all too often at the expense of our humanity and sometimes our planet. So to learn more about Becker or TMT, you can visit us at ernestbecker.org, and that's Ernest without the A, E-R-N-E-S-T. So today we're honored to have with us, as I mentioned, Dr. Sarah Jacket Ray, chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Humboldt State University, and author of A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. We also have Dr. James Rowe, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Cultural, Social, and Political Thought at the University of Victoria. He's currently writing a book called Radical Mindfulness, and some of you may recognize him from our previous feature on discrimination and racial justice. So welcome both, and thank you so much for being here. Before turning things over, I would just like to read a couple of quotes from Sarah's recent article in Scientific American called Climate Anxiety is an Overwhelmingly White Phenomenon. So here's a quote. The prospect of an unlivable future has always shaped the emotional terrain for Black and Brown people, whether that terrain is racism or climate change. Climate change compounds existing structures of injustice, and those structures exacerbate climate change. Exhaustion, anger, hope, the effects of oppression and resistance are not unique to this climate moment. What is unique is that people who had been insulated from oppression are now waking up to the prospect of their own unlivable future. As climate refugees are framed as a climate security threat, will the climate anxious recognize their role in displacing people from around the globe? Or will they hoard resources, limit the rights of the most affected, and seek to save their own, deluded that this xenophobic strategy will save them? How can we make sure that climate anxiety is harnessed for climate justice? So to read the rest of her article, it's linked in the description of this YouTube. And also a reminder to everyone, when we open the Q&A, you can use the live chat feature to the right of the YouTube player. Okay, so James, I will hand the reins over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lila. It's a real pleasure to be here in conversation with Sarah about her really important work on climate anxiety and climate justice. So in alignment with today's topic, it's common practice where I live on Vancouver Island to begin with a territorial acknowledgement. So I just want to note that I'm beaming in from the territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples. So moving to the first question I have, Sarah, in your Scientific American article, you note how survey data shows that folks of color are generally more concerned about climate change than white folks. And yet, as you note in your book, the climate movement has historically been predominantly white, what some scholars have called a green insiders club. And so I wonder if you could kick off our discussion of race and climate justice by speaking to some of the reasons for that historical whiteness of the environmental movement.
Yeah, I think thanks so much for having me. And I want to also acknowledge where I'm beaming in from too, which is Wiyot territory, also known as Arcata, California. But in Wiyot is called Goudini among the redwoods. And one of the main arguments that I write about in my piece has to do with Indigenous sovereignty too. So I do hope we'll get to talk about that. But I think the environmental movement has often considered itself, or it's often aligned with progressive movements, socially progressive movements. And so we often assume that environmentalism is sort of like, if you are for, all kinds of diversity in the sort of deep ecology conceit that, human diversity is as good as biodiversity. And we all sort of, kumbaya our way through to some kind of ecological ecotopia. But in fact, the impulse to create ecotopia in in American history especially, but also in many colonial expansionist ethos too, has been very much about purifying different landscapes, not just of unwanted environmental factors, but also of different types of people. So the notion that pure environmental values or pure ideas about nature are somehow separated from ideas about race and which types of people belong and don't belong in a particular space, whether that's bounded by a territorial nation state or whatever, is a myth. It's always been, those things have always operated together in colonial in thinking and then in US history. And so the long history of racism within the environmental movement is not the dominant story we often talk about with the environmental movement. And I think a lot of people find that argument really strange and sort of like weird from the outside. Like, what person is saying that the environmental movement is racist? That's so strange. But in fact, that has been its dominant historical alignment. And some examples of that, I talk about this in my first book, The Ecological Other, because I myself was fascinated by learning this in graduate school. And in The Ecological Other, I look into this history and think about how it is that the environmental movement actually gained a lot of its currency and a lot of its popularity by tapping into very xenophobic and nativist and even ableist. At the time I was thinking about this was actually mid-19th century, new ideas about what kinds of bodies, human bodies, made up the right kind of nation, a good kind of nation. What would good national body politic have to be required in terms of, the blood of the people who are in it, right? And the bodies of the people who are in it. And so early ideas about what makes a good, good American and what makes a good, healthy democracy were really tied to ideas about land and tied to ideas about what kinds of behaviors go in the land and settling the land and improving the land and this kind of thing were really important. And that's one of the reasons why indigenous peoples were often excluded from lands, because they weren't seen as treating the land in this particular pure good way. And so environmental ideas have long been wrapped up in ways of arguments to exclude different types of people from the American nation and from different kinds of, newly constructed ideas of imagined communities. And, this has been prominent in recent discourse too. When I was writing An Ecological Other in 2005 and 2006, I was really focused mostly on this kind of long trajectory of ableism within the environmental movement, and then how it was triggering kind of militia movements around the US-Mexico border, around the increased flow of immigration activity through wilderness landscapes of the US-Mexico border, and how that was really triggering kind of an environmental anxiety or environmental disgust against immigration. And there's sort of like, fits and spurts of this through US history about wrapping up an anti-immigrationism and kind of environmental packaging, and so I was thinking that we'd sort of moved past that until the last 5 or 6 years. I was sort of thinking those ideas would be really moot by the time my book came out in 2013. But we are back in a very rampant moment of, people like Ann Coulter saying things like, I think that the Republicans should really get behind climate change if it allows us to really clamp down on borders. So there's this real strong sense of climate change being a convenient argument to add to the arsenal of very socially regressive and sort of social control or oppressive policies. And that's really the legacy I'm trying to tease out in the Scientific American piece, the sort of legacy of racism within environmental arguments. Whether many in the environmental movement see themselves as aligned with social justice movements is a different question, but environmental anxieties about population, overpopulation, the movement of certain types of bodies into the pure nature of America has been a thread through American history that we should be really concerned about coming back in big force in this sort of moment of increased climate refugees.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and it's, those ideas have played a significant role in shaping the movement, which is part of why perhaps white people have felt more comfortable within it. And then there's just sort of been a self-reproducing phenomena where, predominantly white people within the movement, and then when folks of color do join, because of their deep concern, oftentimes environmental organizations or even environmental studies departments or environmental studies classes aren't the most comfortable spaces for them, since it often is a predominantly white space. We had a controversy break out in Canada a couple of years ago where Mountain Equipment Co-op, kind of our version of REI, got called out because one of their black members criticized them for the fact that all of their advertising showed entirely white models, such that sort of the norm for people being outdoors is white people, and it just completely erases the ways that folks of color engage with the more than human world. And so that was just a very particular recent instance of the way that the whiteness of the movement can just sort of reproduce itself and repel folks of color from joining, which is ultimately what's required for us to have a really robust multiracial movement able to address some of these really vexing challenges that we face collectively.
Yeah, I pick up on a thread of that example, that great example. Of course, we had, like the day of George Floyd, we also had Christian Cooper in Central Park, getting the police called on him, and we might have been, marking his death too. Thank goodness not. But, this notion that, birding while black or whatever, that sort of, that has become kind of a meme since that experience, since that story came out. This notion that there are certain types of environmental activities that signal one's good environmental behavior, like wearing certain types of clothes from REI or whatever it is, or making sure you have all your reusable containers and bags and whatnot, this sort of performance of ecological subjecthood. In this very much a capitalist consumer model, right? That these are about things I consume, and therefore that's the makeup of my environmental identity, has been very much about class and tied up with race as well. And so I think that there's that particular story of what it does to mean to be an environmentalist. It has been very white, very elite even, and that really ignores this wide swath of all these different types of environmental behavior that don't even get registered as environmental because they don't look this particular way, and they're not done by particular types of bodies that look a particular way. And so, lots and lots of people from many different communities have been very environmentalist for a long time. If you define environmentalist as having a reciprocal relationship with the more than human world, whereby its thriving is recognized as important to human thriving, right? So that if that's what we define environmentalism, we see this in other communities way more than we see them in white communities. So whiteness can be actually conceived in that logic as being very unenvironmental. But if we define environmentalism in this very, very narrow way, then yes, it is only for a particular kind of person. And so I really want to be critical and think critically through this term and what it means to be environmentalist, so that we're not just narrowing it down, but the dominant mainstream environmental movement has been that kind of narrow definition. And what I was really trying to do in that article and in my previous book was to say, look, there's this whole gamut of environmental behaviors and traditions and legacies that get ignored completely because it doesn't look like this one particular thing. And the people doing it don't look like this particular thing, which is where the damage of something like those models comes from, or creates that creates so much more damage when you see only a particular type of body doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, again, it ends up just weakening what Dorcetta Taylor's called the Green Insiders Club, in that it needs to be a green everybody's movement. If again, some of the significant barriers that we face to action, like again the massive concentrated power of the fossil fuel industry, to counter that, we need again a multitudinous, multiracial movement where everyone feels welcome. So I just want to pivot to our second question here. In your Scientific American article, you reflect on the reception that your climate anxiety book has had so far, Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, and you ask, why is this is a quote of yours from the Scientific American article. You say, why is the interest in climate anxiety so white? Is climate anxiety a form of white fragility or even racial anxiety? And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the intersections between climate anxiety and white fragility, and how unaddressed racial anxieties in the environmental movement might weaken efforts to address climate change, and obviously also weaken efforts to achieve racial justice.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah. So Like we've just been talking about, my research area had been environmental justice. I'm thinking about these intersections between environment and race and justice and oppression and social movements. And wonder, I've always had this puzzling question: why is environmental movement so white? Why do we have such, why is my race, my whiteness, and the environmental circles I'm in having such a hard time with this one? And what are the actual critiques from the outside of this? So I've long been engaging with that scholarship and thinking about that. But when I wrote the book on climate anxiety that you just held up in 2020, I wasn't primarily bringing that lens necessarily into thinking about climate anxiety. And in the few years that I sort of pivoted my research towards more psychology and social psychology, because what was happening is that my students were coming into the classroom completely ill-equipped emotionally to handle class, life, homework, showing up to graduating, much less the futures that they were going to be inheriting. And in fact, I really was starting to feel like the inability to imagine a future that they desire to live in, that they can imagine thriving in, their ability to only see sort of death and apocalypse in their future, unlivable futures, as I say in that article, was really debilitating. And I wanted to switch my research towards figuring out how to solve that problem. What do we do as educators with this generation who need to be up for the task, what's ahead of them, and how do they need to be up for that task? And so hopefully we can talk a little bit about that too. But in the shift to those kinds of questions, it was interesting to me that the majority of people who are thinking about things like psychology or well-being or existential questions were not as diverse as people thinking about environmental justice. And I kept finding myself in circles where we were talking about climate and psychology, and that was the radical fusion, but justice was left out of it. And I kept thinking, where are the justice people? What happened to the justice? Isn't justice necessary for this conversation? And vice versa. Don't these worlds need each other just as much as environment needs justice and vice versa? And so I was trying to puzzle that through, especially in the wake of the resurgence of the movement for Black Lives that happened after the murder of George Floyd, which happened about a month after my book came out, right? So, this was all happening, and I thought, wow, how has the climate anxiety world not reckoned with these things? Where is that reckoning going to happen, and why is it important? And it took me a good year to really chew on that question, to bring these types of analyses together. And it really, what struck me was when I looked at current examples of what Betsy Hartman has called green hate. Current examples meaning like the Christchurch or the El Paso shooting, where climate change is actually mentioned in the suicide note as a reason to shoot all these people at the border, right? That climate change, like any kind of environmental apocalypse or ecological damage, causes a lot of big feelings, right? And for people for whom there haven't been a lot of other existential threats, what Mariana Heglar calls existential exceptionalism, which I love that language. She says, when you say climate change is the biggest number one existential threat, it's not that people of color disagree that climate change is a big deal, but just that it ignores all this other history. And it says, it basically communicates, I've never had any existential threats like slavery or colonialism, but all of a sudden I'm facing climate change as a privileged white person, because privilege buys us insulation from existential threats. So when she was saying existential, exceptionalism, she's saying, you can say climate change is a big deal, but please acknowledge that climate change is intertwined with, it compounds all of these other forms of big problems. And it actually is, those big problems exacerbate climate change too. It's a reciprocal cause relationship. So, the notion that, a lot of big white feelings around climate change might turn people to galvanize people to do really bad things to each other is pretty common actually in world history. I mean, anxiety of, big feelings that we don't reckon with or don't regulate tend to make us react impulsively from kind of a limbic hijack situation where, we act fight, flight, or freeze, which is usually not a rational or even sometimes self-preserving thing to do. And, what I'm calling for in that piece is for people to say, okay, while we're feeling and doing all the good work of diving right into all the big feelings, which I'm not saying we shouldn't do, we really should do that work. I didn't write a whole book on climate anxiety and then decide, oh, maybe actually it's not a good thing to do. I still very strongly believe that, and that's what I want to spend the rest of my career working on. But we can't do it without the racial analysis, this history of environmental feelings causing all these bad things. We need to have awareness of all that. We need to know when we say climate change is the greatest existential threat we've ever faced as a human species, we need to know how that might land on communities that have faced other existential threats that have also then caused climate change. I mean, it's all wrapped up in these things that I think, without that analysis, we run the risk of people becoming socially really oppressive and exclusionary and xenophobic and isolationist, with taking these fears and running with them that direction. And the right wing is already doing that. I mean, so in the US anyway, the hardcore right wing folks are happy to use climate change to foster and broil up a lot of fear about the other, and so we environmentalists who care about social justice really need to be concerned about that.
Awesome. And I just have a follow-up. You've already touched on this, but just want to dig a bit more in. Climate change is increasingly framed as an emergency and an existential threat, and I definitely use that language myself, and I think it's accurate for sure. And yet, in your book, you talk about some of the risks, and you've already touched on some of this in your last response, but some of the risks of that crisis framing and that urgency framing from a climate justice and racial justice perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the risks of that frame, even though I think we both agree that it's totally accurate, but there are some risks if there aren't some sort of accompanying moves made at the same time.
Yeah, and this is where I really love the work of Adrienne Maree Brown in her book Emergent Strategy, and so I really want to acknowledge that a lot of these ideas are, I'm pulling together all of these brilliant ideas from people who are doing this analysis from within the climate justice movement, and the critique of urgency that folks like Kyle Powis-White, for example, brings up. Then there's the climate communication folks who talk about urgency as a particular strategy in a particular rhetorical context, depending on the positionality of the deliverer and the receiver of the message, right? So there's all kinds of ways we can talk about this, from climate communication, from justice, from mindfulness. There's urgency. We could talk about urgency in all of those settings, and I could talk about it all day. But you wanted to know just about the justice, so I'm thinking here about Kyle Powis-White's work, where he discusses how urgency often does this thing of making us skip over the time it takes, the work it takes to do deliberative, consensus building with a lot of variety of maybe opposing ideas, right? So if we're in a situation where urgency becomes the name of the game, marginalized voices or non-dominant voices always get overrun, right? Like, urgency is the best way to say, we don't need civil liberties. We've got 9/11 going on, right? I mean, like, there's often been the sort of shock doctrine use of urgency to get people to give up their power or to agree to different types of forms of either oppression or giving up your rights. So, similarly in the climate justice movement, when we talk only in terms of urgency, it ends up becoming an excuse to not to do the work it takes to listen to a lot of different perspectives and try to come up with solutions that actually do justice to social justice movements. And urgency also has, it can be kind of a manufactured urgency as well. The sort of notion that there's a deadline by which if we don't do X, Y, or Z, and then it comes to that date, then, the apocalypse is going to happen on that date or something. And this kind of urgency actually has the effect of making people not engage and not act. And so there's that backfiring effect. The psychology around urgency is such that people actually it may have an initial shift, right? There may be a nudge in behavior or initial shift. Urgency does tend to get people to move on stuff, but it often burns out really quickly or doesn't result in lasting change. And it can, like I just mentioned, have the effect of actually overriding more, more marginalized voices in the discussion. So, I think, and when you think about urgency, Kyle Powis-White will say, climate change has been happening for 400 years. What's urgent about it now? It's only urgent now because white people all of a sudden care, right? So there's a sense of, the urgency thing being actually kind of a reflection of privilege. And I can see it in all of these ways, right? Like, I kind of feel like it's great that, if people who've been isolated from this stuff are now no longer isolated from it, are now getting mobilized around it, that's a good thing. But while they're doing it, it's very important to also be sensitive to the fact that they're coming late to a game that most people on this planet have been suffering for a lot longer. And so that kind of like, all of a sudden, this is all about me and my suffering and my existential threat it does a lot of damage. And that the urgency around my existential threat being the most urgent does even more, right?
For sure. Yeah, maybe I'll just insert a terror management theory perspective here. Some studies have shown that apocalyptic framings for climate change actually have had the paradoxical effect of increasing consumptive desires and also intensifying the human nature binary, so a real clinging to human exceptionalism as a response to having climate change framed as this impending apocalypse.
And also reducing care for other, right? Like desiring to shore up your own safety and protection, and less desire to be generous or compassionate towards other people, I would imagine too, right? I mean, does the theory say that too? I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Well, yeah, no, for sure. Like from a TMT perspective, that kind of framing is likely to intensify attachments to preferred worldviews, and so like a kind of defensive attachment that serves as a buffer, an anxiety buffer to that existential threat. And so, in a consumer capitalist society such as ours, that means intensified attachment to the very system that's driving many of the ecological problems in the first place. It could also mean intensified attachment to white supremacy, if that's a worldview that is held. And so there's just a generalized defensiveness that can be generated from that dire existential threat framing.
That is wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, totally. That resonates. I mean, I never had seen it from that particular perspective, but that validates everything else that I've been trying to say about, from the story of a discourse, storytelling, from the perspective of storytelling, and psychologists will tell you that stories that, like Joanna Macy's work that says that stories that make us feel like we're living in a great unraveling into total chaos and doom, make us not want to do the work it takes to avoid that fate. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's interesting. It's wonderful to hear that perspective too. I got to go and dive into that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's just, another reason to be mindful of how, the very real threat of climate change gets framed. And it's also good reason to collectively begin better resourcing ourselves in this culture when it comes to dealing with existential matters, particularly death and finitude, so that that reality can start prompting existential gratitude and appreciation instead of debilitating defensiveness, which tends to be the case now. And that leads into my next question. And since this webinar is hosted by the Ernest Becker Foundation, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about death. And near the end of your book, you've got this beautiful line where you say, this is a quote of yours, that facing death, both the planet's and ours, opens us up to love that is necessary in order to sustain the work of climate justice. And can you just say a little bit more about why you think facing both our individual deaths and ultimately planetary or species death at least is a path to love, resilience, and improved climate justice activism?
Oh, that's an intense question. I love it. I was just telling James beforehand that I'm just so excited to talk to people about death, because usually when you talk about anxiety, people don't want to talk about death. So I'm like, but I really want to talk about death. So thank you for inviting us to talk about death, which is such a taboo topic. And so I think precisely because it's a taboo topic, that's why we're having a problem here, and it has been taboo. I am such a product of a culture that glorifies youth and is afraid of dying. I mean, all of those things. I'm studying this stuff, and I've gotten into this very discussion because of the fact that it's kind of therapeutic for me, because I've been averse to negative feelings and negative affects. And so I've tried to figure out what's the value of them, what can they offer us? What insights can they offer us? And in my own journey with climate anxiety and sort of trying to hold my students' hands through all this and go through this with them together, together with them. I have in my own life, because of my age and having children and that sort of thing, kind of come to my own spiritual need for some sort of balm around mortality. And climate change has really prompted that for me. And, different things can prompt this for different people along the way. And, you can lose people in your life or whatever, but climate change is this kind of like collective, ongoing, amorphous, long system type of a grief. I mean, people who are writing about climate grief and eco grief have defined it in lots of different ways that I won't go into right now. But grief is a useful, if not entirely all encompassing, concept through which to understand what is going on with how people are responding to climate change. Anticipatory grief, people talk about worrying about the future losses that we're going to have, if not the past losses and the current losses. And for me, when I have really hit rock bottom about my despair about all that grief, that is when I sort of thought, well, this feels like facing death, right? This sort of, I'm thinking about Roy Scranton's work here about how to die in the Anthropocene. And this sort of like daily practice of facing death, which in Buddhism is called the five remembrances of the Buddha. This sort of like, I am of the nature to die. I am of the nature to get old. I am of the nature to change. Everything that I love is of the nature to change. It's not actually supposed to be grim and morbid. It's actually supposed to heighten our appreciation of the present, of the now, of the beauty that's right in front of us. And so this constant urgent despair about the future, no matter what true science or objective science is rooted in, is in fact very destructive for our psychology. And it does all these things we've just spent the last 40 minutes or so talking about. It's in order for us to actually cultivate the orientation to the long-term work that we need, the existential and the psychological and maybe even spiritual orientation to that work, we actually, based on everything I've studied, might need to really embrace and figure out about death, figure out that maybe all this fear and this holding on is about this fear of all these other things are sort of proxies for mortality. And the impermanence of the planet is a source of great despair for me, the impermanence of the planet because of stuff that we're doing right now to it. I'm in a constant state of cognitive dissonance and affective dissonance about my daily behaviors being not in alignment. In fact, when I go through my daily metta practice of saying, may I be safe and may I be happy and maybe I be healthy, and I get to may all beings be happy and healthy and safe, I almost can't go there because I feel complicit in the destruction of all beings, right? So it's like, wait, I can't get my spiritual life aligned, And I think that facing death is a really, really important step for doing that, because it's not about being morbid and accepting, just letting all of the apocalypse happen and standing back and saying, let the rapture come. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that when we actually accept this and we face this thing, it opens up all of the possibility for that, the incredible preciousness of everything that's really right in front of us. And so when I have actually had my moments of closest of facing mortality, what it does is it sharpens my gratitude for the most banal, small, tiny things in my life. Like all my senses are exploding. It's like I'm hallucinating with gratitude, And I think that fuels me, that then turns me into having more abundance from which to work from and to go to class and to teach these students and to write the stuff and to talk to the people. And if we can operate in the world from a sense of abundance instead of constant scarcity of our resources, of our inner resources, much less external resources, the planet will be better served, So this is like, it doesn't do the planet any good for us to deny its impermanence. That might seem paradoxical, but it's a sort of an existential trick we have to play with ourselves to actually get into the work in the way that the planet needs us to do. So it's a long way around it, but I love talking about death. So thank you.
No, that's lovely. Yeah, there's this great exchange. Folks can find it on YouTube if they want to look it up. It's the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh in dialogue with the environmentalist David Suzuki, and Thich Nhat Hanh makes this point that sort of blows Suzuki's mind, where he's like, you have to be able to accept that, you know, both the species and the planet are going to die, and that is going to actually make you a more fierce advocate for environmental justice, which again seems paradoxical, but it's just that it means that you're actually attuned with the world as it is. Like, the earth is an impermanent phenomena, and for us to genuinely love it, we have to love our own impermanence, and we have to love the earth's impermanence as well. If we're going to really, you know, have a commitment to the more than human world, that's a fundamental part of it. And so
I also think there's something about ego here too, that that if despite the fact of its impermanence and despite the fact of our own impermanence, we still find some reason to do the work, I feel like it might remove our ego a little bit from it. We're not doing it because we want some outcome that we can pat ourselves on the back for. You know, we don't need to see some kind of outcome. This is where Joan Halifax calls us why, you know, the wise hope rather than kind of hokey hope or something. That, you know, this is about not needing a telos, not needing like an outcome that proves in some sort of instrumentalist way that our work has resulted in something positive. And I think detaching from that need or that expectation is part of it too, right? That if everything's impermanent. Okay, let's get to work. You know, I mean, there's a sense of liberation to that removes my ego from it. I feel like I wish that it was easier for young people to get to this. I think when you talk about mortality and death, my students are just like, cannot go there. This is not at all inspiring to them. This doesn't feel like a key to unlock their anxiety at all. But boy, do I wish that they could have these gems of thinking, okay, if I accept impermanence of the planet, it actually will permit me to engage in this work in a way that's not so anxious, right? It's not so attached, as the Buddhists would call it, you know?
Yeah,
so,
well, yeah, and ego is one of our primary defensive mechanisms in the face of impermanence, and it blocks us from the fundamental richness of ourselves and the wider world. And so, yeah, if we are able to sort of dilute that or weaken that ego a little bit, it connects us to that abundance that you're talking about, that super abundance of solar energy that animates earthly life, including ourselves, that I think we're restricted from with our egoic defensiveness. And so yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah, you just answered your own question right there much more succinctly than I could have. So it was beautiful. Yeah.
Well, this just a last question before we open it up to the Q&A, and it just dovetails nicely from our last discussion. One of your projects is working collectively to develop an online existential toolkit for climate justice educators. And I wonder if you could just share sort of your currently favorite piece of advice from that toolkit.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a project that's mostly to help educators figure out how to integrate the psychology and the justice lens better in their work. So the probably target aim for this is like environmental educators or climate educators. And I think that the stuff that's coming in, we've just, you know, my colleague and I, Jen Atkinson, and I have just sorted through all of the submissions, and we've just gone through that first stage. And of the things that are really just lovely to see coming in and just exciting to think about, that I just think, oh, I can't wait for this to be a tool that people can access, has to do with the ways that environmental educators are starting to shift away from thinking that their job has been to communicate and educate the problem to students and leave them in a state of horror and fear, and moving towards much more of this insight that we've just been talking about, that self-preservation, being resourced, thriving, desiring your future are actually much better indicators for whether or not people will engage in the long term in any kind of collective action, right? So any kind of action. So if the end game here is that people are engaged in action to protect the planet for the long term in a just way, right? Not in any old way, but in a just way, they really do, it turns out, need these interior skills. And the research happening in climate psychology with folks like Renee Lertzman and Caroline Hickman and Faith Kearns and gosh, Britt Ray, there's just a lot of wonderful people doing this work in climate psychology, coming together with folks who are doing a lot of work on justice-oriented stuff. The notion that this interior work is really important. So some of the stuff that's coming in is just sort of straight up contemplative practices in environmental classrooms, which is a newish thing. I mean, there is a wonderful book out there called Contemplative Practices and in Sustainability Higher Education, or those words together. I really recommend. People have been thinking about this for some time, but that's not the only way to go. There's all kinds of other things. There's a couple of folks who are coming in with intense gaming and play theory, right? So how does play or gaming access a particular kind of psychology in our minds and help us override some of our barriers to think in new innovative ways into solutions and actually make it fun and pleasurable along the way? So there's all kinds of strategies that are coming through. My personal favorite strategy is this the sort of rethinking the story. And so in my book, I have a chapter called Hack the Story. And the sort of easiest thing that we can do is to be very, very critical about and thoughtful about the story that we live in every day, that we're building about the world we live in every day. And this has to do with every single item of information we consume on a given day and the mindfulness that it requires to be disciplined about that. To me, that's something you can do kind of right now, in this moment, right the second you get off of this YouTube video. You know, I mean, you can think about, okay, am I going to go onto my phone and consume some junk and give my attention to all of the bad stories happening in the world? Or am I going to ask myself, what else is true? And see what else is true that's not as prominent in the media that is paying a lot of money to get my eyeballs. So, you know, a very good attention on a daily basis to the stories we live in and consume and disseminate is my personal favorite hack. But it's really cool to see all the other things that are coming in for this project. So thanks for asking about it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Wonderful. Well, that was excellent. And now I look forward to hearing questions that folks have. So Lila, please send the questions on. All right, so I think folks are potentially typing them in.
Yeah. It was kind of a surprise. We're done.
Yeah. What's going on?
Or responses, you know, that's fine too. Comments.
Let me ask, so Sarah, I have a fourth year environmental studies class on mindfulness and social change where we do mind-body practices on a regular basis. Have you had experience bringing some contemplative practice in the classroom, and how has that landed?
I want to take that class. Can I say, are you doing it virtually? I want to join it. I audit it. That sounds like a great class, James. Oh gosh, I want to see the syllabus. That's a very good question. I struggle with this, I have to confess. I feel like I have needed mindfulness and contemplative practices, but I feel weird imposing that on students and saying, you need this. So I've struggled with that. I have done some things like walking meditation. I've had people sort of emulate Buber's contemplate a tree, you know, I and thou stuff, where I have them go contemplate a tree. And I've had a regular practice of having 2 minutes of silence at the beginning of my class. So that's not a lot. 2 minutes is not a lot, but it's just like this opportunity to transition and to have a free pause in the day for students who don't get any free pauses. And so there's a sort of like mini Sabbath built in there that I feel is super important, not just for the work we're doing together, but just for their lives. I'm not very explicit about it. And this is one of those places where you and I were talking before the session, where I feel like sometimes my work doesn't align with what I'm caring the most about now, which is that I, as a chair and a professor of classes that are sort of set in the curriculum, I don't get to teach classes that are just about this stuff. I have to kind of sneak it in, you know, because it's research and analysis and environmental studies. Okay, so how do I bring in contemplative practices here where their students will accept them, you know, because as we all know, if you're not willing to do it or wanting to do it, it doesn't work. So it's been a struggle. I have to confess, I I struggle with it because I know it works for me, but I'm not quite sure how to make it work for students, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that container piece is key. Like I know the environmental justice organization Stand.Earth, they have a practice of doing a 12-minute meditation before all of their like all of their staff meetings and everything, which is the idea being that if you take 10 to 12 minutes to connect with yourself, you're going to be more able to connect with others and actually have a more effective meeting. But they have to really kind of onboard staff in terms of being able to do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, like it's challenging to just suddenly drop a 12-minute meditation on students or colleagues without quite a bit of scaffolding to set it up, and
Yeah.
otherwise it can feel like an imposition.
Yeah, and if you had a selective audience of people who wanted to sign up for that, then you could just jump right into it.
Exactly.
But your class title would select students who presumably would want to at least try. And I can imagine having a grand old time reading your book that you're writing and reading a bunch of scholarship on the need for interior practices in order to engage in the cause you care most about.
Yeah.
Then trying to do some stuff, right? Like, to me, that scaffolding would be an intellectual, it would be the topic of the class. It would be the content we were reading. It would be the podcast we were listening to. And that would be really fun. And I would love that.
Totally. Okay. So I've got a question here. Okay. So Sarah has written about this, and I would love if she can talk about how we can teach about white climate anxiety in the classroom without recentering whiteness and recentering white supremacy. In other words, how can educators make environmental education more inclusive?
Oh, who is that? This is so exciting. Okay, that's such a great question. I love this question. This is a question that foxes me to this day. So this feels like okay. If anybody in the audience has a good answer to this, I feel like I'm still learning much about this. Environmental studies classes have been predominantly white. This is changing, and at my institution, it's changing pretty radically, in part because we try to center justice in our definition. It's in everything, you can see here, it's in the words, in the promotional material, we have justice in the center. But also our institution's changing and California's changing, which is great. The next generation, Generation Z, is also going to be the most ethnically diverse generation that the US has ever seen. And so the environmental crisis is becoming so much more evidently connected to all these other kinds of crises that people are facing. So I think the environmental field is going to just inherently be taken over by a different demographic, which is wonderful. I used to teach an exercise that I think is still a very useful exercise called the Environmental and Class Privilege Knapsack Exercise, which you can find on pachamama.org. While you're at it, donate to them while you're using it. And it's sort of like your sort of Peggy McIntosh white privilege knapsack exercise, where there's lists of statements and you say yes or no to these statements if they apply to you. And the statements are things like, I can go to a national park and not think about and enjoy the wilderness and not think about how the history of my people in this landscape. Or I can work in my garden and not be presumed to be, a farm worker. There's all these kinds of, I can think about polar bears and not have to worry about the air I'm breathing, these kinds of really binary, this was a really illustrative exercise to help people realize what it is that environmental justice is about versus what the mainstream environmental movement has been about, and how they're really quite different, and that it's not a natural or automatic thing that environmental movement is going to inherently be good for all people. So it's a useful tool, and I really do appreciate it. But it has the effect, when I have taught it in the past, of making a lot of the white people reckon with their privilege for the first time ever. And so the class becomes oftentimes a space of working through a lot of white fragility to move white people kind of through the ladder of white privilege towards allyship. And that's important work, and I think we need to do that work. But it does center the white student's experience. And it occurred to me at some point when one of my non-white students said something about all the white fragility in the room, and I thought, oh, okay, yes, got it, right? And it has changed the way don't teach that exercise the same way anymore if I ever teach it at all. And I'm much more attentive to the emotional journey of students through this sort of awakening around their own complicity in all of these planetary problems and social injustice. That journey is really important for students who have never reckoned with that stuff to go through, but it's very important to not let that particular story hijack the whole class, because it has the effect of being like, everybody sit back and let the white people heal themselves, right? So, there are many ways to circumvent that. There are many ways to work against that. But the first thing is to recognize when you're doing it, which, like I said, it took me at having a student bring that mirror up for myself. One of the great ways to do that is to, first of all, is to make sure that particular narrative is not the only one you're talking about in the class. And there are all kinds of ways that actually I can share. I've done a workshop on this, and there's some strategies to that too that I'm happy to share at some point too. But yeah, while we're working through white climate anxiety in our classrooms or any kinds of settings, let's just be mindful of the ways that how much oxygen it takes up in the room, because the climate anxiety might not be the only emotion in the room.
Absolutely. Awesome. So we've got another question here. So we know from TMT that our tendency to other increases as threats to our safety or reminders of our death increase. How do we connect and reduce the tendency to other as the impacts of climate worsen? So I'll maybe throw it to you, but I'm happy to have a go at this as well.
I would love you to talk about this. I'm stumped, and I want to know what you have to say about it.
Well, for me, it's a really challenging question, but I think that any strategies that we have that can reduce our defensiveness are crucial. And for me, my go-to are contemplative mind-body practices, particularly meditation. And there was an excellent TMT study done a year ago or 2 years ago, maybe now, looking at the role of mindfulness in reducing that defensive response when facing sort of mortality priming or death reminders. And the sort of basic finding was that if we actually sit with the reality of death and actually give it some space and time, that actually reduces the defensiveness. Whereas it's when we're sort of faced with it and then kind of move on, and it gets sort of sent down into our unconscious, where it gets sublimated into a defensive response, that's where we're going to get into trouble. And it's actually by sort of facing head on some of these difficult affective states like death fear, that we actually expand our capacity and resourcing. And so I really do think that efforts that run parallel with environmental justice work to sort of enhance our cultural resourcing in the Euro-American world, where we can sit with finitude, with more capacity, then I think that defensive response will get mitigated. And instead, that gratitude that you talked about, Sarah, from your own practice, I think that can start to get amplified versus defensiveness. But we need to practice, and it needs to be really intentional, because again, we don't have the resourcing in this culture for dealing with that. And even as someone like myself who practices different mind-body practices and whatever else, without broader supports in the culture, it's easy for me to get quite defensive in the face of existential threat as well. So we really needed this to be a collective endeavor. And I do think that different mind-body practices, ritual, ceremony, things that we don't tend to think of as political, have a really important role to play in shifting our culture such that we can actually have grown-up conversations about the fact that we're going to die.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that great answer, which is just reminds me of how much I just gotta go meditate. Yeah. I'm feeling it, so I'm gonna go. But another strategy I use anyway, is that whenever I get flustered and feeling defensive when I'm watching some kind of news thing, or there's some kind of thing happening with those crazies over there, what are they talking about? What are they doing? The fact that fear and negative emotions like anger and outrage, that we're living in this politics of outrage world where the more outraged and more fearful you are, the more money you can make as a politician. And this kind of thing just scares me. And I get caught up when I think about what was happening, in Israel and Palestine recently. Like, just there's all these things that are happening all over the place, all the time. India, that I shut down, and I have that feeling like you just described, that it even happens to you. I get that feeling of, oh, I'm just going to check out. I can't even face this stuff. Like, I want to go do spiritual bypass, as they call it, like I'll just like not engage, I can't engage this stuff. And so that's a real danger, right? So because I don't want that to happen, my strategy is to always be asking, what else is true? Besides this story I'm receiving, what else is true? And sometimes what that requires is scaling much more into the realm that I have some control over. I don't have control over that thing. I don't have control over that thing. There's something true that I have some control over, that I can contribute in some way, some generative, life-giving energy in the world I live in. Okay, where is that space? And so that scaling in until I can see the kind of field of play that I can actually contribute to, and other people are doing the same, looking around and seeing all the people who are doing the same thing as I'm doing, trying to contribute, is very buoying to me. And it doesn't make me feel defensive. It doesn't make me feel shut off from others. It doesn't make me feel like I have limited resources to give, right? So all of this kind of, these are disciplines against that impulse to shut down. Shutting down is like an innocuous thing, but shutting down can also turn into kind of what Karen Lifton calls the misanthropic temptation, right? Like, we're seduced by misanthropy when we hear all the bad things happening that humanity can do, right? So where is all the good stuff, right? I mean, not to go Mr. Rogers on you, but there is actual, like, many wisdom traditions will tell you that it is better to cultivate an inclination of the mind that is towards the things that you can control and that are positive, that fuel you, and dominant media would not like you to do that, because that keeps you disciplined, consuming, needy, anxious. And that's the way that neoliberal capitalism wants us to be. That's a good state for them, for us to be in as individuals. So, if we don't want them to have that kind of power over us, there's things we can do,
Yeah, no, and I love that, just always having that question in your kind of holster at the ready of like, what else is true? Because that connects you up to that abundance that you're talking about, in that there's just a plurality of viewpoints always alive in any moment. And we can fall down the rabbit hole of one narrative and get stuck on that as the scarce one thing that's real. But no, there's always manifold possibilities. And to have that question at the ready of what else is true helps you connect into that abundance in a really lovely way. That's super helpful.
I've been reading this great book called How Emotions Are Made. It's really dense and it's hardcore like neuroscience, and I'm struggling to keep up with it. But the punchline of the book is basically we make our emotions. And I thought, this is just nutty, I mean, of course we have a reality we live in that constrains and conditions our emotions. But in final analysis, like, there is so much power we have over to create our emotions, and that this book shows through neuroscience that I didn't realize. That's pretty empowering.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, so I've got another question here. Has the pandemic provided any insights in terms of how we will react in the face of the existential threat of climate change? For example, does it seem more likely that we will respond with compassion or through exclusionary behavior for self-preservation? Great question.
Oh, I love that question. That's like the question that I want to write another essay about. I mean, I have so many thoughts about that. I would say my overall answer to that question is that I'm not encouraged, at least in the US context, by what the pandemic has exposed. But that's when I'm thinking about it from kind of a mainstream news story. And then if I look at sort of local responses or what's happened to my students or anecdotal just around me, I'm very optimistic. So there's a both and that's happening there. And that kind of reinforces the previous point, that the main story is this one of division and failure and lack of leadership and all these things which are not they are very true. And also there's this other truths, which is that all kinds of people came out of the woodwork and did extraordinary things that we would have never, ever done. There are things now that are in the mainstream conversation around connections between things like infectious diseases, climate change, police brutality, long-term racial, structural racism. These things are being put in conversation kind of in a mainstream way that they've never been before. So there is incredible things that are happening along those lines. The notion that caregiving would be a kind of infrastructure required to make the country run is like something people have been saying, feminists and people have been saying for 40, 50 years longer. And, many indigenous traditions have known for some time, ways of being with kin and family and extended family that help people deal with the fact that neoliberal capitalism is not helpful, around care. So there's some really great things. My answer to that in sum is sort of a both and, there's a lot of great stuff, and also this is pretty discouraging. The way that COVID exposed injustices and medical access to medicine, injustice, uneven access to health justice, that happened simultaneously as the rise of the re-rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, exposure of violence for people of color. This connected with climate change is really the best I've ever seen the climate justice movement look, excuse me. So I'm very excited about those things. There's a long way to go, but the consciousness awakening that's happened in the last year has just been awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think the both and is so important because there's been so many openings, but then also, closures as well on multiple fronts. And again, maybe drawing from TMT, but or terror management theory, but the toilet paper panic at the beginning of the pandemic is a sort of paradoxical phenomena where some, including myself, have argued that there's an existential element to that sort of rush for toilet paper because it helps distinguish us from the animal world. We're not poop anarchists like my golden doodle. We wipe and we really sort of cling to this toilet paper, which is indicative of our exceptionalism compared to, again, the animal world. But of course, the reality is that accelerated purchasing of toilet paper then accelerates deforestation, which is actually seemingly one of the drivers of new pandemics in the first place. And so this is just another example of why we need more cultural resourcing, so that when we're faced with threat, we don't react in this defensive way that then just worsens the problem.
Yeah. Yes. And that was something early on I was very concerned about. Will we, in our recovery, in the sort of like Arundhati Roy's beautiful essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," so sort of like moment, are we in the tomb or in the womb here? Are we going to come out of this crisis and reinvent some systems in the ways that the climate has been demanding us do for some time, including things like indigenous sovereignty and police reform and abolition and all kinds of other things that many people are now seeing as connected to climate change finally. Are we going to do those things, or are we going to, just build back normal, build back the old ways? And I think there's going to be a little bit of both, there's going to be a little bit of both.
For sure. Well, that's a great segue into what I believe is our final question, which is, what ideas for system designs might help us collectively, not simply individually, diminish exclusionary behavior or othering?
That feels like something I need to think about. I operate in the realm of culture change, so my sphere of influence and the place I like to think about culture change is like culture and the individual. So the systems change question is harder for me. Do you have an answer to that, James? Do you have thoughts there?
Well, I guess it gets a little bit away from the existential plane, but maybe ending on a point of hope. I really am hopeful about the integrative vision that is the Green New Deal, and the way that it brings together class, race, and gender, and obviously environment as well, all together in this integrative program. You talk about how care work is now understood as infrastructure, and the Green New Deal has actually significantly impacted the Biden administration already in terms of that infrastructure bill that you mentioned. That we'll see what happens with efforts to actually bring it into force. But that integrative vision that's bringing justice and environment together is incredibly hopeful. And then, for me, I'm interested in how environmental organizations like Stand Out Earth that are helping to push a Green New Deal are themselves integrating mind-body practices into their work, so to fortify them and resource them as they're undertaking that work. And so when I talk about mind-body practices, it's not simply just as an individual that we undertake these, but as part of our social justice collective work that then supports that efforts to bring forth this larger change that's heralded by the Green New Deal, and I think in really hopeful ways.
I think you just put the nail on the head. I want to kind of amplify what you said, that one structural thing that can happen is that recognition of negative feelings and fear of death and anxiety are hampering our best work. And so we need to do this interior work in order to engage on this on this larger scale. So I love that. We could have a structural change on that front. That would be fantastic. And I was also just thinking really quickly that there's some discussion among immigrants' rights groups that with the baby bust of of this generation that we're living in, that we're actually would be better off if we started to really get lax on immigration, right? So that we could start to actually bring in a population to keep the economy running, right? So this sort of like using the argument of the economy, which the Republicans like to use as their sort of litmus test, as an argument to increase immigration, is a kind of a structural, hey, maybe actually, this could be a solution. The problem is that can then turn on its head and turn into kind of like, y'all need to start reproducing like crazy to save the nation stuff, right? So we don't want, that's the kind of like stuff that was happening in the early 20th century in the US that was linking reproduction and motherhood with nation building and that sort of thing. That we don't want to go there, but there is some potential structural change around immigration policy too.
Awesome. Cool. So I see Lila's rejoined us. I could keep going for a while here. This has been really enriching. Thank you so much, Sarah. But maybe I'll hand things over to Lila to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your time and insights today. I agree, we could have kept going forever. So also
not forever.
Well, not forever. Right. Yeah, let's be clear on that. Also, thanks to all of the people who attended and for your very engaging questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions as usual, but for those who had questions that we didn't get to, if you email info@ernestbecker.org, I can pass along any unanswered questions to James and Sarah if you guys are willing to answer a few follow-ups. And a recording of this webinar will also be available after today, or actually probably immediately, on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And finally, if you enjoyed the webinar, please support us by signing up for future events and notices. You can tell your friends about us or make a donation at our website or linked in the description below to help us continue holding future events. All right, well, would either of you like to add anything before we close?
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, and go read Sarah's book, or both of her books, but
yes,
most recent. Excellent.
Bye.
Cool.